Hello, I'm Rose McLarney, and I'm here to share with you my new book, a collection of lyric essays, Rubble Masonry. And it takes its title from stonemasons' term for working not with stones that are cut to ideal shapes, but the natural shapes of found rocks. And in the book, I get to know the place in which I happen to find myself in the American South, in history, in an ecosystem, in the form of a woman's body, and build my writing with these materials. The title also connects quite literally to my husband's interest in stonemasonry, which developed when we moved to where we now live in Georgia. And we just moved here because it was the closest mountain to where our academic careers required us to be. And while he was out hefting rocks, I was sitting at my desk. My response was to research and type about the area's distinctive geology and its heritage in other forms. And of course, write about the place that I am originally from, in a different region of the South, Western North Carolina, the mountains there. So our current home in Georgia stands on what one of my essays, Settling In, refers to as quartzite, which is good material for the foundations of home because it lasts longer than granite, good for grave markers as well. So instead of physical structures, you can probably hear the kind of metaphor that might lend itself to making. And the title finally connects to my turn from writing poetry to writing essays. I've published 4 books of poetry. I edited a poetry anthology. I edit poetry for a literary journal. I'm a professor who teaches poetry at Auburn University. So that's a lot of poetry. But this is my first prose publication. And over the years that I've been composing poems, I've collected many pieces of information, facts and quotes that didn't fit in the small space of a poem, and these essays were constructed both with them and to house them. You could think of it either way. Um, and I said it was a turn to writing prose, but it wasn't a turning away from poetry. Rather, it's trying to come to prose with everything I've learned about musicality and image and metaphor and space and leaps and implication from poetry and craft essays that are as artful as possible. So I want to just go ahead and read an essay to get us started. This one it's a brief one, and the title is A Good Pour. The airport bartender says she works in an airport because she doesn't want regulars. I don't frequent airports because I like to walk the same quarter-mile of creek each evening and see tadpoles in the puddles again, the heron standing in the current. The Flint River originates under the Atlanta airport. The Atlanta airport has the most departures of any in the world. The tadpoles' lacy thin legs appear merely decorative, floating by their sides. The heron only ever seems to need one leg at a time, folding the other away. The airport requires 4,700 acres of space. It is too far between the airport gates to walk, so passengers must crowd into subterranean trains. There is no room for the river. It is piped out of the way, down even lower than a subway. A person cannot, of course, take liquids or aerosols or gels through security. Having surrendered drinks, you must covet the other half of the can. The flight attendant doesn't pour in your plastic cup. If you did not purchase water or refill a bottle, queuing up to bow your head and bend your knees at the fountains before takeoff. Most likely, you won't have time for a pause, to sit down for a meal at one of the airport's more than 100 restaurants. Unless your flight is delayed and you are stranded and hungry for many hours, which is the other likelihood. In food court kitchens, knives or any potentially dangerous tool must be tethered to cooks' workstations so no one can run in and grab them and force a pilot to crash a plane. So, some things do stay in place. And the river isn't contained utterly. The Flint emerges downstream. Then fishermen catch big bass in it. Though the fish aren't safe for human consumption due to pollutants, including antifreeze washed off from airport runways. Air travel is a major player in melting the glaciers. What change are jet setters seeking? Is it just of scenery? What do they really want to see? The sea is rising and coming to us in our home ports. But I don't really want to critique the more adventurous with their light backpacks and quick dry attire. In truth, when I've traveled, I've been embarrassed by my bad packing of suitcases I could barely close, how I always tried to cram in an entire wardrobe. I just want to point out that here at home, there is something others find worth fighting for. Where the river flows southward in locations landlocked and droughty, Florida and Georgia compete for rights to the resource, to pump it for irrigation. I just want to say that before the river gets to a state border, nearer my 12 acres of property, there's a slow stretch where rare lilies and relic trilliums bloom on the banks again every spring. And when I say I'll have another these days, I mean a glass of water. Uh, there's all kinds of issues going on at the Atlanta airport right now. That's not why I chose this piece, though. It's just a lighter take on some of the eco writing that I do. And I hope you can hear some of my aims that run throughout the book and appear in different ways. But one of those is to play with language, to share my love of words, because I think language is beautiful no matter the difficulty of the subject matter. And in many of the essays, you'll hear rhyme and alliteration, and I'll talk a little bit more about form in essays as I go on. But this essay, if you could see it, is all one big paragraph, which is pretty unusual for me. But that's because my concern in this one was less with space than cadence, kind of getting a quick timing to the sentences. I'm going to go ahead and work towards reading another piece to you. And this one is about my home in Western North Carolina. So if you're at all familiar with my poetry, you probably associate me with the Southern Appalachian Mountains. And the title of this next piece I'm going to read, or part of, I'm going to read part of it, is Without Conclusion. And since the title is Without Conclusion, hopefully it's okay to kind of just take a part of it. But I do want to give a sense of the kind of braiding of different sources that I'm doing in the longer essays that are too long to read in entirety um, in this presentation. So the essay Without Conclusion, if you could see it, is in couplets of a sort. So pairs of 2 paragraphs per section. And there are various essays in Rubble Masonry that are in couplets or have other intentional forms of white space and segmentation. So one essay, Another Inscrutable House, even has like a nod towards the duplex form, which is a contemporary poetic form that was invented by Jericho Brown, in which the last line of each stanza repeats as the first line of the next. And in the case of my essay, the last word of each of my sections repeats as the first of the next paragraph. But this one that I'm going to read from you now, Without Conclusion, is in couplets, and I'm gonna, I don't imagine there are people out there reading along with me, but I'm going to start on page 123. One of the first phrases I spoke as a child was "Mommy shovel, Daddy type." I was explaining the structures of our family's particular little culture. I've turned out to be the typing sort, a writer who only exerts herself trying to manage words. Though my earliest speech was about my mother's power, recognizing her strength was not the same as asserting likeness between us. There are only about 200 speakers of North Carolina's Eastern dialect of Cherokee, and most are over age 50 today. But Tasawagi is not a dead language. More young people are studying it with the elders. It is one of the most challenging languages to learn, a teacher acknowledges in the newspaper article. A language cannot be saved by singing a few songs or having a word printed on a postage stamp or poster. It cannot even be saved by getting official status for it or getting it taught in schools. It is saved by its use, no matter how imperfect. Someone posts in the comments section of the article about learning Cherokee. Native folklore, I have read, should not be expected to provide a pairing of every single thing with a secondary meaning. There may not be a precise metaphor or clear lesson to extract, as there are from parables in the European tradition delivering their grand finales. I want to say something about my mother's influence, how she carries on in the actions of this person she shaped. What poetic image could I join to such pure statement to make it more literary? The laurel branches my mother gathered from our woods at Halloween and stitched to my bear-shaped backpack for a tree costume? Were those to illustrate me being authentically rooted and a creature ascending? I picture my mother's hands painting sections of my hair with bleach, followed by red dye, washing and tinfoil wrapping and waiting at each stage. Was the waiting an analogy for my maturing? Were the streaks that she lamented looked like blood, but granted me anyway because I was a teenager and that was my desire? Representations of the harm of the larger world from which she could no longer provide protection? Or was her creating them, making a mark on my head that I couldn't have achieved without her help, a reminder of our blood, our genes in common, even as I outwardly changed? No few moments are sufficient to define the love she put into my living, but these are better than nothing. And even if I could capture and record every action of hers, I wouldn't be content with just her one lifespan, to let it end. It is a blessing that there are histories, memories, links greater than ours. A mother is a leader who wants her young to clamor after her as best they can, to survive their ignorance as she survives her own wearing down. It takes students years to learn Tislagi. Some must be puzzled to find that it does not have equivalents for all the words of English, to find that instead of goodbye, it is necessary to use a more complex phrase, such as let us see each other again. While the Cherokee language often forges many connections in one word, it does make a distinction between words for animate and inanimate things. The language varies the way colors are applied to each. So there is one way of speaking of the color gray if applied to a stone. And I'm guessing, hoping, it wouldn't be the same word used to describe the shade that the hair on a living woman's head turns. Black, as in the color of a mourner's dress, must be distinguished from the black of a bear who has been hibernating, perhaps with cubs she's been nursing for months, grown hungry, who will bring her body back up out of the earth, show her sun-reflecting fur. I've spent years trying to write about my mother. Whole books should be about her. My last poetry collection, Color Fast, was supposed to be about her before it expanded and turned into something else. But writing about my mother almost always comes out maudlin. And I was finally able to express something of my love for her in this essay that I at least hope is appealing to other people by incorporating information about the Cherokee language, my old elementary school, my selection didn't include this, but there are some references to Werner Herzog films. Um, in the essay, I admit having no Cherokee heritage, only having proximity, having grown up in an area that was the principal Cherokee settlement. And I also admit my lack of knowledge of the language. I could not learn a bit of it when I tried to use a language learning program, which is the fault of my brain, not the program. Um, but I discussed what I remember the newspaper article saying. It's not a primary resource. It's communicating, an impression of an effect. So this isn't a defense of ignorance. And I don't purposefully tell falsehoods. Uh, I do want to learn, and I want readers to feel that they might learn something after spending time with my pages. But I've always been aware in poetry as well of, subjectivity and the shifting quality of recorded history and personal memory. And so I am always acknowledging those in my essays, and now that I'm talking about them, acknowledging those to you. Uh, so I want to go back to form here, but I'll just say that what I can promise is even if it's not, citable nonfiction, is writing with an aesthetic commitment to convey an authentic effect emotionally and intellectually. And when I'm in the process of writing, at least, that feels actually like a pretty big task to give myself. But back to form. The couplets in this essay allowed me to pair material and then occasionally let irreconcilable or stark truths kind of stand visibly alone. So if you someone out there does happen to be reading along with me, it wasn't just that I couldn't think of anything to fill the space on pages 123 and 124 where there are one paragraph sections. That was intentional. So I'll just read one of those one paragraph sections again to illustrate what I'm talking about. Uh, Native folklore I have read should not be expected to provide a pairing of every single thing with a secondary meaning. There may not be a precise metaphor or clear lesson to extract, as there are from parables in the European tradition delivering their grand finales. So I think you can see why I might stop with one paragraph there to sort of illustrate the point of not forcing a connection, not extracting a meaning that isn't there for me to extract. Um, so throughout the book, these coupleted essays or these coupleted sections are used with intentionality. And this one other thing on form in this one is without conclusion ends with an em dash, so sort of an incomplete sentence. And the last essay in the book uh, also ends with an em dash. This essay that I just read to you from is For My Mother, and the final essay is an essay about a daughter, my daughter, except I don't have a daughter. She doesn't exist. It's a dreamed of daughter, but because I wanted it to connect to the essay about the actual mother, it in both of them in these em dashes. So they're a continuation that is also an opening for the reader to contemplate. Finally, I want to read to you a little, I guess we could call it a love essay for my stonemason husband, who's also a nonfiction writer, so he'd probably prefer a love essay to a love poem. And it is about making a life, which I guess we could say is one way to say it is making do with the materials that you have, and the other way, if you just stack the words a little differently, is to say, making the best, and that's what this piece is kind of about. It alternates between quotations from the book Stonemasonry Made Easy, which presents itself as just a practical reference. But to me, looking at this book, it seemed to offer wisdom that applied to much more than constructing physical walls. And I paired these quotations with fragmented sentences of my own that illustrate and enlarge those sort of aphoristic qualities. And it also is appropriate to read this piece because Rubble Masonry is the title, and this is the one that I will read today that is about rocks. Oh yeah, I've lost my place in my own book. Um, okay, sorry. This is, I guess, what it is like to read from a new book. This is one of my very first readings, so thank you all for bearing with me. Anyways, this is several smaller stones. The stone masonry book says, ideal assemblages can only be realized with cut stone. With rubble masonry utilizing found materials, these are just ideals. So, the dark but stars, the winter but bonfires, blistering summer day, and a siesta in its midst. A long commute from the office to a house in the forest. Economy car. Discovery in the discount bin. Camellias browning before the azaleas open. Laurels after daffodils. Never one without the other being over, but still, flowers. Waist thickening, yet the legs beneath the floppy dresses slim. Tumor, copay, weight, non-covered, but not cancer, praise be. A friend who can monitor her diabetic daughter's glucose from overseas. No way to touch or tend the child, but at least milligram and decimal readings that speak of blood and sugar. Dry stacking a stone wall, rather than using mortar, allows the structure to freeze and thaw without cracking, to respond to changes in the earth. How women in the Civil War substituted possum for chicken, gunpowder for salt. Like them, today trying vinegar in place of citrus, for sugar, sorghum, stevia leaf, or pure imagination instead. the teacher pulling the rows of institutional desks in a circle. When the catalpa worms eat all the riverside catalpa trees' leaves and, fattened, fall into the water below, the fish feeding, and the fisherman waiting over from his bank to cast a lure, the wish for a purebred hound, tall and leggy, guarding the door. Then the stray who lays in the grass, reveling in the softness on her belly, came. Instead of a larger perfect stone, you can use several smaller ones. Mint leather lining and waterproof black boots, polka-dotted satin inside the gray wool blazer, a place for the Easter egg in the fence post or under a flower of the exact same color. Hummingbirds. During the phone calls, long hold, counting tree frog toes pressed to the window. Boxes emptied of their first gifts, but cats pressing themselves into the cardboard's dimensions. A cousin's daughter, close enough to call her niece. Grandmother gone, but the scent of powdery perfume lingering in her clutch purse. In the months between visits, mother's stitches holding up the hem and on the button. Don't worry about a few gaps in a dry stacked wall. Light and shadows are pleasing to the eye, but cement usually is not. Neighbor who knows better than to mention the election, anything beyond the weather and garden. The movement of creek water, of leaves and breeze, the perfectness of their irregularity, and how no scientific explanation makes nature's doings plain. Snaps that hold bra straps to dresses, by candle instead of lamp. Never stop closing the bathroom door, no matter how long you're married. No need to know who he remembers when his eyes go dreamy, if it's memory or wish. The storm door's extra layer of shelter in winter, in summer opening to the warm with the screen door's filter. My love finding stones in the surrounding woods, bringing them to our acres, practicing balancing and fitting quartzite, dolomite, and schist together, using gravity and a long through-stone's weight to bind the pieces in their position, walking from our house along the path we've worn, thinking how I'd carry a child so it wouldn't seem too far to her, how I'd lift the ginger's heart-shaped leaves to show the pods called pups attached to the stem, going out to be beside him, reading what he reads. On the first page, the book began with this advice for minimizing a project's difficulty. Choose a site near a pile of rocks. So I guess to be true and real, since I was talking about those things earlier, in an individual and maybe flawed and human way, I will tell you one other main drive behind my essay writing. And that could be that I kept hearing people talking about writing prose that was as beautiful as poetry, but not seeing as many examples of that, as much as I heard it discussed. So I kind of wanted to contribute to that effort, not to compete or do it better than other people, but to contribute what I could do as a poet to this other effort of enlivening language that perhaps whole different audiences are willing to read because it is something other than poetry. Um, so I've spoken about a little bit about the I, at least in my case, as unauthoritative, but I've also picked up from the, I would say, pretty expert poet Eleanor Wilner, this idea of the transpersonal we. Bear with me. She writes, the we poetry invokes opposes the crude us versus them of political rant. I do not think poets, and I will add essayists, should cede the collective noun to those who negate thought, abuse the language, and divide us for their own ends. And so I would like to sort of share her aspiration of writing towards what she calls this imaginative vision of a common condition, um, while using an individual writer's irreducible and particular experience of what could not have been seen another way. So thank you for seeing that my way through the heady quotations there. Um, if that's not the sort of approach to thinking about books that appeals to you, how about this? The other reason you might be interested in my book, or what makes it the kind of nonfiction I want it to be, is that it is real. So since you are seeing a video of me in my home, it takes things like this, my grandmother's teacup from one side of the family, or this, which is the mortar and pestle from my grandfather, oh, great grandfather's drugstore on the other side of the family. So it takes these things that are real and it tries to make them yours, the readers, through the writing. Or alternatively, another example for my show and tell here. Um, it takes rocks. I've talked a lot about rocks because of the title. Here's one. This is some quartzite, which you just heard me read about. You can see why that's a good, this is natural. Came out this way. So it takes stuff like this that is sturdy and solid, and then it takes the somewhat more ephemeral stuff. Like right now outside, we have these wild azaleas blooming, and the very last, the daffodils. As my essay, Several Smaller Stones, said, these things do not usually exist at the same time. Usually, the daffodils stop blooming before the azaleas start. Um, but in my writing, I think that I at least strive towards taking things like these flowers and making them lasting and being able to braid and bring different kinds of things, different seasons of thinking together. To wrap up with some more concrete examples that are actually in the book, I'm just going to kind of look at the table of contents and make a little list for you of some of the diverse topics that I touch on here. Not comprehensive, but just to give you an idea in case some of it piques your interest. Uh, Picking cotton and growing exotic lilies, eye houses, which are a two-story house style, and the lyric eye in poetry, closed adoption records and the evolution of the doorknob, grandmothers and tattoos, vernacular architecture in the Cherokee language, experimental electronic music and traditional boats, the collision of a circus train and my desire to be a mother, and uniting all of this, monuments, gravestones, eroded stones, uh, thematic through stones, and touchstones. And if there are audience members who would like to ask me questions, happy to open it up for a Q&A now.
Thank you so much for that, Rose. That was really wonderful. I'm always fascinated by poets' ability to write in and master other genres, and I feel like I learned so much from your approach to the lyric essay, and I'm just really excited to talk to you about it.
Well, thank
I
you.
wanna, no problem. I want to thank everyone as well for tuning in. Thank you for spending part of your afternoon with us. I would like to specifically shout out Tracy from tuning in from Kansas, Rashad from Toronto, and the Third Thursday Poetry Series in Auburn. So thanks for all being here with us. I also would like to encourage you to put a question for Rose in the chat. If anything comes to you, no question is a bad question. We're happy to hear anything you've got, and we'd love to spend this time to have a conversation with Rose. But to start, did you mention that this was the first time reading from this collection, or have you read from it before?
I read for very few minutes at a reading at the AWP conference, but I'm not sure that really counted
Yeah,
because
I'm just
it's kind of hectic.
right, right. Yeah, that's a special place to read anything, I think. I'm just curious if there's a difference kind of reading these lyric essays than reading poetry, if it's whether it's like a register or like if they just even come out differently.
Well, I certainly leave myself a lot more visual notes when I'm writing a poem, like I don't, because got the line breaks, wonderful things for a reader. So I don't necessarily have to think about it as much. Coming to reading these essays, I was, having to remind myself to read them slowly for the audience, but it really was, it still worked, I think. I was still able to use the form of prose in different enough ways that I wasn't getting lost as I was reading. So I was glad to test it out and see that I can still use white space to slow myself down or run sentences longer if I'm supposed to speed up. So I was still able to put those cues for myself in there, and I think that the reader at home who is reading to themselves will hopefully get those cues as well. But yeah, it was I thought it would be more different to read prose than poetry than it is. But I think that's because of the style of prose that I have written that makes it sound driven.
We've got a comment in the chat from Leah that I'd like to read. Leah Ullman says, really enjoyed hearing your voice today, Rose. I so look forward to spending time with the book. Very best to you. So,
Oh, thank you. She's
yeah.
got a wonderful book out herself. And you're an essay writer too, aren't you?
It was that Leah here?
No, I mean
Let's
you, Corey, you're an essay
Oh yeah,
writer
yeah,
too.
I am. That's why in part this is fascinating to me because I don't know if I quite understand what the lyric essay is. I feel like it always escapes me, so I'm always super fascinated and as a nonfiction nerd to talk about the kind of logic that these essays have, and I'd like to get into that, but I really love the show and tell portion because I yeah, I just it was cool to see kind of the things that maybe inspired the book, like the actual physical objects. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about maybe some of the things you were reading or watching, or maybe some art or any some things that you were kind of engaging with as you were writing this book.
Yes. So I guess I'll start with the more literal part of that answer. I was actually there are a lot of source references that that to which I am indebted. I should give them some credit. So, home place and the social use and meaning of folk dwelling in southwestern North Carolina by Michael Ann Williams. Obviously, a more academic book, but I drew heavily from that. Monuments to the Lost Cause by Cynthia Mills and Pamela Simpson. Um, Houses Without Names, Architectural Nomenclature and the Classifications of Americans, Common House by Thomas Hubka. And let us now praise famous gullies, Providence Canyon and the Soils of the South by Paul Sutter, and also a lot of literary influences. So I mentioned Jericho Brown's form playing into it. Some of the essays include shout outs to the poets Rebecca Gale Howell, Roger Reeves, C.D. Wright, Louise Glick, Juan Ramon Jimenez, Ellen Bryant Voigt, then Omar Khayyam, different time period, but yeah, Elizabeth Bishop and James Agee, of course. So those are important writers that are referenced in the essays. Um, and of course, there are also nonfiction writers that have taught me a lot. And some of those that I think probably are important to everybody who writes lyric essays. So Maggie Nelson's book Bluets and basically anything by Leah Purpura. Um, And then I also read Heather Crissel's The Crying Book uh, around the time I was writing some of these essays. And your question includes, I think, an opening for me to talk about other art forms in addition to the literary. So I will say that during the time I was writing this, I was looking at some of the work by Mark Dion, who's this artist who creates curiosity cabinets, among other things, but he sort of appropriates architectural and scientific methods of uh, collecting and ordering and exhibiting objects and makes us kind of question, uh, how much editorializing goes into that way of framing knowledge. And I'm lucky that the closest art museum to me in the fairly small city of Columbus, Georgia, has some of Mark or one of Mark Dion's pieces, as well as a Joseph Cornell assemblage and a Kara Walker cut paper silhouette. So it's great to have those nearby because assemblage, like Cornell, seems very similar to the technique that I'm at least trying to use when I'm putting together my pieces for an essay. And then Walker's work, cutouts or in other media, um, always provides a really unignorable call to reconsider representations in history and think about what's been left out or who's been unjustly moved out of the center of stories.
Thank you so much for that, Rose. I'm really inspired by this really diverse list of yeah, just inspirations, and it reminds me of just like different kinds of arts, like like the arts of like even like crafting or or like just something with with the hands. Like it just feels like just from talking, it's like there's a lot of like walking and seeing and a lot of things that maybe we don't think as much, we don't associate with writing, as
Yeah.
much, when you think about like sitting down with like a keyboard. But like here there's just a lot of movement, which is really cool.
If you could see some of my drafts, they really, especially with the essays gave me a headache. You got to keep the threads going for so long. I really admire prose writers more now that I'm doing it. With a poem, it's its own kind of hard work, but I was skilled in figuring out how to do that in the space of a page or two. With the essays, I would be printing them out, and there's boxes that I'm drawing on them, and there's arrows, and then I did the post-it notes to map things out. There was just a lot of figuring. I have all this interesting stuff, and how am I going to move between it? And I would try so many different combinations and then find, that there were gaps and I needed a whole new post-it notes. But so it definitely was not a beautiful handcraft that I was making by any means, but it did become an almost hands-on thing, much more than just typing.
I've got a question here from Ken Autry from the Third Thursday Poetry Series. So thanks for asking, Ken. Ken asks, what extent is the idea of rubble masonry a metaphor for your writing?
Hmm. Well, I think it is, as I've kind of talked around before, it is descriptive of my technique of piling stuff up and trying to make it all stand. Um, but I didn't really discover the title until fairly well along into the project. So I didn't know it was the metaphor, but it was. The I think the first essays that I wrote for the book were about my grandparents. And I did not know that the stone theme was going to come in at all. I wrote one for my grandfather, and then I thought, oh, I'd better write one for my grandmother. And then I had to think about what it even meant that I was writing essays. I hadn't particularly intended to write essays. They just kind of came out that way. So yeah, I suppose it's a metaphor that I discovered in the process, or it's a metaphor that made itself for me.
I want to thank Earl Shook from tuning in from Kansas. Thanks for being here with us, Earl. I'd like to talk actually a little bit more about movement, if that's all right, as I continue to try to understand, the logic of any essays, but lyric essays in particular, and these essays. I'm just curious if you could tell me a little bit about kind of how these essays move from one to the other. Like, is the logic like linear? Is it associative? And I guess I'm talking about maybe um, not only from time, from place to character, just like how are we moving about?
Okay. Um, well, I guess I'll start by before getting to my essay is to say I hope that time does not move only entirely linearly. I
Right.
hope that what we have known to be true remains true even if it's once it's over. If it was true at a time, it is still true for you. I hope that the experiences that we've had can matter as much when something more mundane is going on in the given moment, that we can, go back to those important things as a sort of mooring point. And I hope that like the future plans that we build towards, if we do them with, full intention and commitment, matter even if they don't get to come to fruition, that what we meant is still meaningful. Um, so I guess I like to think that the essays don't need to move in a linear chronology. That said, beneath all my efforts to be creative and try to seem like I would be reasonably fun company to be around, I'm pretty uptight, like in a way of like linear. My brain wants to go linear, so there's a lot of like negotiating with myself, and so there is some linearity in the book, I think, in that it just didn't make sense to me if I didn't sort of group the essays with a little bit of idea of geography in mind. So the things that are, and a little bit of chronology in mind. So if they're things that are about my childhood in North Carolina, they probably belong more on this end of the book. And if there are things that are about my adult mindset where I am in Georgia, they probably should go somewhere more over here. So there's not a clear timeline in the book, but there's some thought of an arc. I guess I'm always thinking of arcs in my book, whether it's poetry or the essays. And I don't know if anyone else would even notice this, but there are 8 essays per section in the book. I couldn't help myself in trying to balance them in that way. But beyond just the little like the I guess like the poetic line counting being manifested in essay form, I think that I'm also trying to create a tonal line. So I never want my books to end on a total down note, even if they deal with some pretty dark material. So in this case, I think I put the hardest to stomach essays in the middle of the book. Um, and I'm not like forcing a happy ending, but that is again just of thinking of an arc. So it's sort of more of a tonal or emotional organizational principle than totally rational, but it is still linear in its own way, I suppose. Um, does that make sense?
Yes, that totally makes sense.
Sort of,
Er,
yeah.
it does, it does. Earl from in the chat responded to the earlier part of your response of your answer, and he was saying mosaic, which is cool, and also reminds me again of like another kind of visual arts term, which I think is kind of cool.
I like
I
that.
want, yeah, I do too, actually. I really like that. Thanks, Earl. I wanted to talk a little bit about origins. And I guess to start, I wanted to ask, um, maybe like kind of how you found the format of the lyric essay for this collection, or when did you know that Rebel Masonry was going to be a collection of lyric essays, or did you kind of start writing and you know like what kind of a chicken and egg question, but I'm just curious if you
Sure.
could talk about.
Well, I mentioned writing essays for my grandparents, and so that's how it started. It was not long after my grandfather's funeral that I ended up just sort of writing what is, um, partially to honor the process of the book, the first full-length essay in the book. It's called Weights and Measures, and it's about other things, and in many ways, it's about what was problematic about his character. So it's not a full-fledged tribute. Maybe I'll write one of those some days. But that just kind of came out of me. And it's also one of the jumpiest, strangest, I think, in terms of structure, essays in the book. Um, and so I wrote it and there it was, and then I sent it off to a literary journal just in the sort of weird state of mind that I was in, and it was accepted within hours. And so that doesn't happen. That has never happened again. I'm not saying like so that is not a goal to have. That's not like how it always goes for me, certainly. But I took that as a sign. Like, oh, oh, I'm maybe there is a place for these really weird essays. So I've likened that particular essay before. People use the term braided all the time, and that essay, which is also about, among other things, about running. Now, I've said it's like a ponytail that's fallen down over the course of a long run or something like that's sort of the organizational, but it's a kind of a weird essay. So I thought, okay, there's space for that in the world. Let's explore. And then I wanted to write an essay for my grandmother, and that one isn't structurally as leaping, but it uses the other area of strength that attracts me to prose, which it contains a bunch of quotations. So I had a bunch of old letters from the family, and they would have just been the quotations would have been too bulky to go in a poem. So then I thought, okay, there's also like this practical use to essays. So here we've got two, let's keep going. And there were definitely times where the essay writing was hard, as I've said before. For me, it was a new thing, and I was like, well, why am I, do I have to write more essays? But at that point, I already had enough that I could begin to see a book coming out of it. And so I kept going with, as I've mentioned before, a hope that maybe I would be able to reach some new readers that way, because some people just they don't think poetry is their thing. And even though these essays are very unexpected in some of the ways that they move, I think, and very and metaphorical and driven by implication, maybe people will give them a chance who aren't poetry readers.
I want to give everyone in the chat one more chance to ask questions here. I've got about two more planned for Rose, and then we'll call it an afternoon. So if you have anything else to ask, now is a good time to put it in the chat. Um, Kind of switching by, thinking about what you just said, Rose, I'd like to see if you had any recommendations, maybe for someone who is new to, lyric or non-traditional essays, maybe just one or two or three kind of lyric essays besides your great new collection that they could read.
Sure. So I had mentioned that, like, I think that people who are writing lyric essays would, many of them would agree with me that Leah Prepara and Maggie Nelson were influences. And I mentioned, I think it was Heather Crystal and Rivka Galchen as books that I knew I had floating around me during this process. The latter actually was more after I had written the book. I didn't discover it until, but it was just like helpful to see that no, I wasn't crazy to think this was a book. So those are some of the creative nonfiction writers that I have enjoyed. Another one is, let's see, I actually have some notes here. Well, got little weird arrows on these notes too. I was thinking actually during the time that I was writing the book, probably the biggest influences were C.D. Wright and Paisley Rechtel, who are poets, but they're genre blurring poets. So Paisley Rechtel has a book of poems, Nightingale, that has an essay stuck right in the middle, which is just a perfect example of what a lyric essay can be. It even is about song and time. So check out Nightingale. And then C.D. Wright, like nobody's ever been able to say exactly what she's doing. She's doing C.D. Wright's thing, but she's got these book length poems. We could call them docu poems, but they are sort of made polyvocal by the use of quotations. So I think that even for essay writers, that those can be really useful to look at.
Thanks for those recommendations. And thanks again for being here with us this afternoon. I also want to thank everyone in the chat one more time for tuning in. I've got one more question for you, Rose, and this is the standard last question we ask to all of our authors who come on, which is, what have you been writing since this book, you know, came out? Or, I mean, obviously it's a long process, right? Like we've had it kind of, marinating for a while. So what's kind of been taking on in your artistic life since Rubble Masonry?
Sure. I have what appears to me to be a poetry manuscript. It's got to sit for a while and let me make sure that I mean that. But yeah, so there's poetry manuscript. It's in the drawer. And while that is sitting there, while waiting for me to appraise it, I have been writing more little essays. I didn't know if I was going to write more essays. I thought maybe this was what I had. But I have been drafting them. And so my question is, I guess I have to figure out, we were talking about chronology. Are the essays going to be a different book because they're coming later in my life and different things have happened and it's addressing those? Or are they going to kind of run alongside the book of poetry, and will they discuss some of the same notions in a more expansive way? I don't know that yet, but I yeah, so I'm in that process, but I thought for this question I would cheat a little bit and go back to something that I've written in the book by way of answer, because my drafts are a mess and I should only talk about them so much at this point. But I just wanted to close by reading the last paragraph of the essay Remains to See. True, more drafts than not I throw away. Maybe the wrinkles from squinting to shield pupils whose blue irises are too pale to handle the light they're shown will form my lines at their best. But I will keep looking. This much I can promise, and this much I will express. Admiration of the wide-eyed sight of fish, their lidless vision, which does not end even when it rests.
That's a great end. So I think that we'll end it there. Before we go, Rose, is there anything else that you would like to say?
No, thank you everybody for the questions. It was nice to hear some names that I recognized and some new names out there.
All right. Well, until next time, thanks again, everyone.